by the Trump campaign to undermine the outcome of this election. So first, I just want to say we are extremely proud and excited that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are now President-elect Biden and Vice President-elect Harris. Despite a global health pandemic, 148 million Americans, the most ever, voted in this election, and 75 million of them, a record number, voted for Biden and Harris. Biden rebuilt the blue wall, winning Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. And we will win Arizona and Georgia when the counting is done there too. In fact, I believe the advantage that Biden currently has in Georgia is actually larger than the advantage that Trump won Michigan by in 2016. President-elect Biden won Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Nebraska too by larger margins than Trump did in 2016. And that's because he assembled the kind of broad and diverse coalition we needed for a decisive win and to be one of the only people in American history to unseat an incumbent president. African-American and Latino voters, suburban women, and independents fueled the president-elect's clear win over Donald Trump. And so while you've heard noise from Trump and his allies, for example, the Republican Secretary of State in Georgia said the Georgia election was administered well. The Republican chair of Cobb County in Georgia called on state and national leaders to respect the outcome of the recent election and, quote, transition in grace. And of course, former President George W. Bush called President-elect Biden and Vice President-elect Harris to congratulate them. So what we're seeing from the Trump campaign is just that. It is noise. And in a moment, I'm going to turn it over to Bob, who will explain a little bit more about why that is. But before I want to say clearly and definitively that the American people have spoken in this election, that our democracy and the principles on which this country is built are stronger than any attempt to undermine them, and that Joe Biden, who won more votes than any president-elect in the history of the United States, will take the oath of office on January 20th, 2021. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Bob Bauer to walk you through in a little more detail.
Thank you very much, Kate. And I am here today with our General Counsel, Dana Remus, and I'm going to make a few opening remarks and then we'll take your questions. The purpose of the briefing today is to put in perspective some of what you're reading and hearing about, which is noise, not really law, theatrics, not really lawsuits. And I want to focus on a few very specific issues. Number one, why these Trump lawsuits are failing around the country and will continue to fail. I want to pick out a couple of specific issues in the legal process that you should be familiar with, any upcoming recounts and what they might mean, and particular arguments that you're hearing from the Republicans, certainly fraud, most notably, but also supposedly linked to this argument about fraud, the exclusion of observers from polling places. And then I'll say a bit about the state legislative activity that you may be hearing about, where I think there are also some significant misconceptions. And when I'm done, I think you're going to find out very quickly, or you're going to understand very quickly, where the real fraud in this process actually lies. But let me begin by talking a little bit about the lawsuits to date, just to give you an overall perspective, since you're reading that they're being filed, but the disposition isn't always very clear. Through Election Day, from June through Election Day, judges have dismissed Trump campaign lawsuits in this election, against this election, as utterly unsupported by evidence. That's just from June through Election Day. 6 suits dismissed on that basis. Since Election Day, the pace has picked up, and judges have dismissed another 7 cases that the Trump campaign brought in these states: Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, and Pennsylvania. So that's quite the one-loss record, losing time after time. Now, I want to just go through a few of these to give you a flavor for what we're talking about. Let's take, for example, 6 months ago, to go in the pre-election period and talk about a Trump campaign effort to limit the ability of voters to vote by mail, including by drop boxes. And there, the Republicans made their usual argument that these drop boxes, the use of these drop boxes, would lead to fraud. The judge who heard the case, by the way, was a Trump appointee, and he invited the campaign to come forward with evidence. Of course, there was no such evidence. And I say, of course, because you'll see it as a theme that runs throughout all these cases. And he threw the case out, saying that the contentions, the fraud-related contentions that the Trump campaign made, were purely speculative and unsupported by the evidence. This is a case, by the way, captioned very specifically, Donald J. Trump versus Bauer. So this is a Trump campaign lawsuit. Another lawsuit in New Jersey that had to do with ballots cast after Election Day as provided for by the state legislature. There too, the judge threw it out, finding no evidence whatsoever that the mail-in balloting program adopted by New Jersey would lead to election fraud, including specifically no evidence that the voter fraud would result from ballots that were cast after Election Day, that there were such voter fraud resulting from votes cast after Election Day. The Trump campaign sued the Montana vote by mail system. And again, a federal court threw out the suit. And here, I think the rhetoric, or shall we say, the measured comments of the court deserve quotation. The court explained that it was required to throw the suit out because the Trump campaign's, quote, contention that the upcoming election, both nationally and in Montana, will fall prey to widespread fraud is a fiction. So the court dismissed it as a fiction. And again, this is a Trump campaign lawsuit, not a party lawsuit. Donald J. Trump for president versus Bullock. And then the Trump campaign filed a lawsuit attacking expanded vote by mail in the state of Nevada. Here too, we have a judge appointed in this instance by George W. Bush. He threw out the case also because there was no evidence, only speculative, far-fetched claims about fraud. Once again, a case brought in the name of Donald Trump's campaign committee. So what you have is one case after another, and this is just a sample, where the claims that they're bringing, amplified through press releases, including the fabled Four Seasons landscaping company press conference by Rudy Giuliani, turns out to be completely meritless, and the courts recognize it as such. In fact, and I just want to focus everybody on what the Trump campaign says when they actually speak to a judge versus what they say in parking lots at press conferences. In a case in Montgomery County in Pennsylvania, this case involved, by the way, the question of whether or not a ballot would be invalidated for missing a signature in a particular location or an address in a particular location, even though the voter's address was readily identifiable elsewhere. And the Trump lawyers were actually pressed on the question of whether they were alleging fraud. And so I just simply want to give you the following from the transcript, because this is what's taking place inside the courthouse and not in the parking lot. Judge, in your petition, you don't claim any of the voters committed any fraud, correct? Trump lawyer, accusing someone of fraud is a pretty big step. We just want to get the election done. Trump judge, I understand, but I asked you a specific question and I'm looking for a specific answer. Are you claiming fraud? Trump lawyer, to our knowledge at present, no. Judge, are you claiming any influence? Trump lawyer, to our knowledge at present, no. Judge, is that required to lodge that challenge? Do you have to accompany your complaint with an allegation of fraud? Trump lawyer, no, it doesn't matter if there was fraud. It doesn't matter if the mistake is a big deal or not. So I think that's fairly telling. Very different than what you're hearing, of course, in the parking lot. Now let's move to the question that you've heard come up repeatedly about observers and lack of transparency because observers were excluded or limited in their access to the vote count in polling places. Let's be clear. Poll watchers are credentialed, they're identified to the state. It is very easy to fact check this claim. And of course, these claims have been repeatedly fact checked. The Republicans, after all, before the election were bragging that they had thousands and thousands of poll watchers ready to go. And it was only after the election on this sham allegation about transparency that they claimed their poll watchers were not permitted to be included. As a matter of fact, they were there in force in the same way Democratic appointed poll watchers were, to do what poll watchers are allowed to do under the election code. And again, in front of a judge, rather than in the parking lot, Trump lawyers have admitted in cases that had to be dismissed because of that admission, that indeed they had poll watchers present. That was true in cases in Pennsylvania and also in Michigan. As you know, and Kate mentioned this a minute ago, the two current senators in Georgia, unhappy about the runoffs they were forced into, complained that the Secretary of State had not conducted a transparent process. And you can read what his response to that was. Republicans attacking Republicans on this bogus claim of lack of observer access. Simply untrue and easily verified on the facts. Two final comments. Many of you are aware that there may be recounts. Let's talk about what it means for there to be a recount. One fact and one fact alone, I think, might answer any question that you have. Since 2000, in 31 statewide recounts, the average change in votes was 430, and the median change was 267. End of story. These margins cannot be overcome in recounts. So the recounts are yet another piece of the political theatrics, along with the lawsuits being dismissed with their claims of fraud. They shouldn't be taken to be a serious challenge to the outcome of the election, and they will fail as such. Finally, my last comment before we take your questions has to do with activity in the state legislatures. Some people are under the impression that a state legislature can not only hold hearings, which it certainly can do, and complain, which it certainly can do, but the state legislature, after providing for electors to be selected by the popular vote, can, after the election, decide that wasn't the way they should have gone. And on whatever ground they give, they have the constitutional right, after the fact, retroactively, to pick electors who are committed to the candidates who didn't win the election with the voters. That's simply not true. That's not in the Constitution. That's not consistent with the Constitution, and that will never happen. But I want to be clear that that's another bit of, call it what you will, puffery, propaganda that's being put out on the Trump side. Again, it is very easy to establish that it isn't true. So with those preliminary comments, Dana and I would be glad to take your questions.
All right, Alex Jaffe, you have a question, feel free to unmute.
Thanks guys for holding this call. I wanted to ask, Bob, you talked about the theatrics of these moves. Are you at all concerned that the Trump administration is pursuing legal challenges to undermine Biden's transition and presidency? And how would you go about combating that? Yeah, go ahead.
No, there's no question, since they can't overturn the outcome of this election and Joe Biden will be inaugurated on January 20th, 2021, that they are pursuing other, if you will, collateral objectives, and one of which is to attempt to instill in the minds of some portion of the populace that the election was illegitimate, and also to throw obstacles in the path of the government. But the Biden-Harris transition is going forward. It's moving along very briskly. President Biden will take the oath of office on January 20th, 2021. And that's going to be our answer to that. I mean, in the meantime, there'll be theater, but it'll be playing to increasingly light crowds until it empties out completely and Joe Biden and Kamala Harris take their oath of office. But I want to pause for a minute and offer Dana an opportunity to comment as well.
Yeah, I would just add that the Presidential Transition Act, an act of Congress, acknowledges how important the smooth and effective transition between administrations is. It lays out the process for the transition, and it ensures that even as the political process is in process producing a winner, that the government must rise above politics and ensure the best interests of the country. And so it has set forth the steps that both campaigns have taken over the summer and take now that we have a president-elect. It governs. We trust that it will guide the steps forward, and it will ensure that the president and president-elect and vice president-elect have everything that they need. As Bob said, they are moving forward. They are preparing to govern. We have absolutely no worry or no doubt that when they take office, they will be ready to go.
We have Yamiche next.
Thanks so much for taking my questions. I have a question. It's a two-part question. The first is about the legal strategy. I know you said a lot of this is just noise, but is there a legal strategy that you would articulate about? Are you gathering evidence on your end and having to proactively kind of get together and have a case together. Could you talk a little bit about how much time it's taking? And then the second thing I have is, I know I've heard Bob say this a bunch of times, and we've quoted you saying it's going to be an embarrassment if they go to the Supreme Court, if it's impossible for them to get any sort of case to the Supreme Court. But at this point, again, do you see any avenue for that?
No, in the past, what I've said is they can push a case up to the Supreme Court. I don't know which one of these losing cases they're going to inflict on the Supreme Court, but they won't win it. They won't overturn the election. I was referring at some point to Donald Trump saying we're going immediately to the Supreme Court, and I wasn't quite sure precisely how he intended to go immediately to the Supreme Court. But if they have cases pending in federal district court and they can appeal them and then attempt to, after losing at the appellate level, get the Supreme Court to hear the case. But the embarrassment will be in the quality of the case that they bring and in the certainty of the defeat that they're going to face. As far as evidence is concerned, they're the ones who are supposed to be producing evidence. We have the evidence, and it's in the form of 75+ million voters and counting. So that's our evidence. Our evidence is the number of people who voted for Joe Biden and the number of electoral votes that he won. Their evidence so far, as I pointed out by walking you through just a handful of this material, their evidence doesn't exist. There's nothing they have to raise any questions whatsoever about this election in the legal process.
Thanks so much.
I would jump in and just add to that, that I think an important piece of this that we can't lose sight of is that it is thanks to experienced and bipartisan officials and poll workers across the country that the election was put on so well in a pandemic, which is a Herculean effort, and they are hard at work finishing the count and certifying the results. And that's how this process goes from here. So while all of the noise is happening in the courts, the actual work of the next steps are on pace, and that is what will answer this. That is what decides the election and has decided the election, like Bob said, not the courts.
We have Jeff Mason next.
Jeff, you may be on mute.
Can't hear you.
Okay, while we're waiting for Jeff, we'll go to Jackie Heinrich.
Thank you so much for taking my question. My question is, what's your best guess at why the GSA has delayed ascertainment? The law only says apparent winner. It doesn't stipulate that states must have certified the results. Have they given you a timeline for an update? And what are the legal options that are on the table? If you can't elaborate on those options, can you point to any cases that might be seen as a precedent or any legal text that would apply?
For somebody to judge how this is done in the past, they should look to the past. And with the exception of Florida 2000, which is a very bad example, I think, as you all know, certainly not at all analogous to this situation, the ascertainment, as it's called, would have been done by now. Now, you read press reports that indicate that the White House is directing agencies to not cooperate in any transition. I do not know whether that's influencing the behavior of the GSA, but I do want to emphasize that however this develops, we can continue and are continuing with the transition. These transmission meetings are ongoing, they're progressing. There's no question that whichever route we travel here, we are going to be moving very quickly and very decisively toward a full transition that enables the President-elect Biden and Vice President-elect Harris to assume office fully ready. But I think if anybody wants to understand sort of what might be taking place at GSA, they should look at the precedent and then measure it against the behavior of the GSA to date. Dana, did you have anything to add to that?
I don't have much to add to that. I think that there's every indication from every corner that President Trump, his campaign, his allies are trying everything to interfere with the inevitable. But we are pushing forward, and we are confident that the inevitable is a very successful administration.
Okay, Jeff, are you able to unmute yourself? Okay, we'll go to Alexa Course at the Wall Street Journal.
Hi, thanks for doing this. I just wanted to kind of ask another question about state certification. A couple lawsuits the Trump campaign has filed specifically asking to halt or delay certification. What do you think about their bids to kind of slow down that process and the claims they're making on that part, trying to attack that part of the process?
You'll see a lot of maneuvers like that probably, or some maneuvers like that before the election. As you know, state certification requirements vary from state to state. The certifying officer varies from state to state. Counties certify, the state certifies. And so, the Trump campaign, again, not with a view toward winning the election, which it can't, but with a view towards slowing things up, may well work with its allies in the various states to try to delay certification. We're not worried about it. I mean, at the end of the day, you can perhaps create obstacles to the smooth functioning of the process, but you can't end in the end of it. When all is said and done, you can't succeed in stopping the process from coming to the inevitable conclusion that Dana just mentioned. So, it's a procedural maneuver that they may attempt, but it's not going to have any effect on the outcome.
And I think it goes back to where Bob started, which is they simply have no evidence. And to succeed in a lawsuit that will stop certification, there has to be evidence of a problem with the process. They have to come forward with evidence of fraud and problems, which despite multiple opportunities to do so, they have been able to do so. So we are fully prepared for continued suits and continued attempts to create confusion and to do everything they possibly can to slow things. But at the end of the day, they have no evidence, and thus they will not be able to stop this process.
Great. That's all the time we have. Thank you, everybody, for taking the time to join us today. We look forward to continuing to work with you through a successful Biden-Harris transition and into a successful Biden-Harris administration. Thank you very much. We'll talk to you soon.
Thank you. Are we back in the holding room?
Nope, hang on, Bob.
Okay.
Bob, there's still some reporters in here, but we are down off platforms. Done.
Thank you.
Jennifer and Matt, thank you so much. Great job. We'll see you next time.